Okay, picture this. You're sitting at a red light on your morning commute. The engine's idling, you're drumming your fingers on the steering wheel, probably a little annoyed that you're going to be late. It is such an incredibly mundane, universal experience, right? But those red, yellow, and green lights hanging above the intersection, they weren't just handed down by nature. This invisible architecture of our modern lives was actually forged through a terrifying crucible of trial, error, intense psychological resistance, and some pretty catastrophic explosive failures. Today, in this explainer, we're going to trace the hidden, honestly blood-soaked evolution of the traffic signal. We'll see exactly how a handful of stubborn inventors literally re-engineered human behavior to save us from our own rapidly advancing technology. Let's dive right in. To really grasp the sheer terror that made the traffic light an absolute necessity, we've got to strip away our entire modern understanding of the road. At the turn of the 20th century, a city street was this incredibly delicate, shared public commons. You had pedestrians, clattering horse-drawn carts, bicycles, and merchants all flowing together under this flexible, informal rule known as mutual forbearance. It relied completely on human eye contact and cooperation. But then, almost overnight, the automobile arrives. Imagine introducing high-speed, 2-ton, unregulated machines into that fragile ecosystem. The informal order violently collapses. The street literally turns into a deadly free-for-all. Between 1906 and 1914, American streets basically became slaughterhouses. Traffic fatalities didn't just tick up, they skyrocketed, surging from 0.40 to 4.28 per 100,000 residents.
So this wasn't just some annoying regulatory headache. It was a desperate daily fight for survival. Think about the psychological shock here. You have a society that evolved specifically for the speed of a brisk walk or a trotting horse, suddenly forced to calculate the closing speed of industrial machines just across a muddy street to buy groceries. How did humanity first attempt to tame this terrifying new reality? Well, their first instinct wasn't to invent new technology. It was to desperately adapt the industrial systems they already trusted. And to witness that first unbelievably dangerous experiment, we actually need to travel back across the Atlantic to the fog-choked streets of London in 1868. Looming in the London fog, right outside the Houses of Parliament, stood this massive, 22-foot cast-iron pillar. A railway engineer named J.P. Knight made this desperate, totally mismatched adaptation. He took heavy industrial signaling tech meant for trains and just dropped it straight into a delicate human space. During the day, a police constable literally stood at the base of this behemoth, yanking heavy levers to operate giant semaphore arms, horizontal for stop, 45-degree angle for caution. But at night, the danger escalated to a whole new level. The device relied on rotating red and green gas lamps. A constable had to stand in the chaotic, muddy crush of horse-drawn carriages and manually turn a leaking gas fixture just to keep traffic moving. Now, for a few fleeting weeks, it seemed like a total game changer. It brought some order, and J.P. Knight actually predicted these iron pillars would soon line every major street in London. But beneath the cobblestones, a silent, invisible threat was building up. A subterranean municipal line was leaking. That hollow cast-iron tower was slowly filling with highly combustible gas. On the night of January 2nd, 1869, a stray spark found those fumes, and the explosion was absolutely devastating. The shockwaves shattered the night, severely burning the constable who was just standing there operating the levers. It was a failure so catastrophic and traumatic that the British government immediately dismantled the wreckage and abandoned mechanical traffic control altogether. Innovation was completely paralyzed in Britain for over 40 years. They just surrendered the streets back to manual policing.
So, for 4 decades, the clock just keeps ticking, and the crisis compounds. Cars are multiplying exponentially. They're getting heavier, they're getting faster. The problem wasn't going away, it was accelerating. Now, let's jump to the life-or-death stakes of American streets in 1912. The crisis demanded a radically new approach. Because without relying on volatile, explosive municipal gas lines, how do you safely control a chaotic intersection? And more importantly, how do you do it from the safety of the sidewalk so your police officers stop getting maimed in the crossfire?
That massive burden fell squarely on the shoulders of Lester Farnsworth Wire. He was a 24-year-old Salt Lake City police detective and the head of the department's very first traffic squad. Wire wasn't just some bureaucrat. He was a commander watching his men suffer every single day. His patrolmen were being forced to stand in the dead center of freezing, muddy intersections for hours on end, basically playing matador with speeding steel and erratic drivers who had zero concept of right-of-way laws. Driven by sheer necessity to save his officers' lives, Wire sought a remote-controlled solution. Actually drawing inspiration from a biblical verse, Matthew 5:15, which talks about placing a candle on a candlestick to give light to everyone, Wire conceptualized what would become the world's first electric traffic signal. Wire built this pitched-roof, yellow wooden box, wired it directly into the overhead 500-volt trolley lines, and set it up so an officer could flip the switches from a safe and closed roadside booth. Mechanically, it worked, but he immediately collided with a powerful, unseen force: human psychology. The public absolutely despised it. There was this intense, visceral rebellion against the idea of surrendering personal autonomy to an automated, unthinking machine. People relentlessly mocked his unpatented invention, calling it Wire's pigeon house or the flashing birdhouse. And the frequent vandalism, people sneaking out in the dead of night just to smash this wooden box, wasn't just harmless mischief. It was a deep, psychological rejection of the mechanized, regulated future that was rapidly closing in around them.
Wire proved that electricity was definitely the technological path forward. But his wooden box was completely defenseless against both extreme weather and human rage. Plus, there was another fatal flaw. It still relied entirely on the flawless attention of a human operator. If an exhausted, freezing officer got distracted for even a second and flipped the switch the wrong way, 2 lanes of heavy traffic would collide at full speed. So this set up the ultimate engineering paradox of the early 20th century. How do you engineer a machine robust enough to withstand public resentment, yet intelligent enough to completely override fatal human fallibility? If we track the evolutionary leaps of this technology, a pretty clear pattern of vulnerability emerges. J.P. Knight relied on explosive gas, which obviously ended in tragedy. Lester Wire brilliantly solved the power problem by tapping into the electrical trolley grid, but he left his device physically defenseless against human resentment and, crucially, operator error. But here's the thing about progress. Every explosive failure, every smashed wooden box laid the exact paving stones for a definitive breakthrough. And that happened in Cleveland, Ohio. In 1914, an inventor named James Hoge analyzed all these fatal flaws and engineered a permanent, brilliant design that finally integrated safely into a standard municipal electric grid. Unveiled on August 5, 1914, at the incredibly busy intersection of Euclid Avenue and East 105th Street in Cleveland, Hoge's system was an absolute marvel of mechanical logic. The true historic milestone here wasn't just the glowing red and green lights, it was the unseen genius hidden inside the control booth. Hoge's engineered what was essentially a primitive mechanical brain. He used conflict prevention through interlocking electrical relays. The switches were physically hardwired, so it was mechanically impossible for the operator to display a green move signal to conflicting directions at the same time. Hoge didn't just regulate traffic, he literally engineered fatal human error right out of existence. He also threw in an acoustic right-of-way code with warning bells and wired the whole grid into the city's telegraph network so they could instantly clear intersections for fire and police emergencies. A massive leap forward. So Hoge's infallible logic solved the problem of conflicting signals. We're good, right? Well, not exactly. The landscape of the 20th century was violently shifting. Between 1914 and the early 1920s, automotive engineering just exploded. Immerse yourself for a second in the primitive, terrifying physics of that era. Massive, heavy steel vehicles, extremely crude, unresponsive brakes, and immense momentum. When these speeding behemoths faced Hoge's abrupt, instantaneous binary change from go directly to stop, they simply couldn't obey the laws of physics. With virtually no warning to hit the brakes, drivers were relentlessly rear-ending each other, tires screeching as they skidded helplessly right into the center of active intersections. The perfect system had just developed a deadly new flaw. We call this the transition dilemma. The race to solve this fatal flaw sparked a rapid succession of innovations right across America's industrial heartland. Let's trace how this builds. We go from Hoge's rigid binary lights in 1914 over to 1920, where a Detroit police officer named William Potts starts experimenting with a third, yellow-colored light suspended over the street. But the defining conceptual leap, the masterstroke that truly solved the geometry of time and space in the intersection, was patented in 1923. And it came from an incredibly prolific African-American inventor from Cleveland named Garrett Morgan. Garrett Morgan's invention wasn't dreamed up in some sterile laboratory. It was forged directly in the trauma of a violently shifting world. Morgan personally witnessed a horrific collision between a horse-drawn buggy and a speeding automobile at a really busy Ohio intersection. Picture the shattering of wood and glass, the terrifying kinetic destruction of a heavy industrial machine plowing into a living animal and carriage. It was a completely chaotic scene driven entirely by the lack of a safe transition phase. That specific visceral trauma fueled in Morgan this obsessive need to re-engineer the reality of the streets. He realized a profound truth. Changing the color of a light wasn't enough. You actually had to manipulate the physical flow of time itself.
Morgan patented a T-shaped mechanical signal that featured a brilliantly simple yet philosophically profound third position. The pure genius of his design was that it didn't merely advise drivers to slow down, it executed an all-directional stop. When those mechanical arms raised, it halted traffic in absolutely every direction simultaneously. Morgan realized the ultimate solution was time. By pausing the entire system, he created a temporal buffer zone. He engineered a forced collective breath into the chaos of the modern city, providing a life-saving window for momentum to dissipate, for slow carriage to finally clear the path, and for terrified pedestrians to reach the sidewalk. His logic was so undeniable, so bulletproof, that the General Electric Corporation actually purchased the rights to his patent for $40,000, which established the rock-solid foundation of the modern automated transition signals we use today.
Now, think about the monumental consequence of these intertwined innovations. It represents one of the most profound, unheralded public health and engineering victories of the entire 20th century. From J.P. Knight's catastrophic gas explosion, to Lester Wire's defiant wooden box, to James Hoge's infallible mechanical brain, and finally Garrett Morgan's mastery of time, it actually worked. By successfully taming the chaos of the public commons and replacing flawed human judgment with cold mechanical logic, motor vehicle fatality rates in the United States absolutely plummeted. They fell by more than 50% between 1914 and 1930. This invisible architecture of safety literally shielded an entire generation of urban dwellers from the onslaught of the industrial age. Which brings us to the profound geopolitical marvel of the modern era, perfectly represented by a single number, 72. That is the number of contracting parties to the 1968 Vienna Convention on Road Signs and Signals. Just pause and think about the magnitude of that achievement for a second. In a 20th century world deeply fractured by borders, immense language barriers, and hostile political ideologies, humanity universally agreed on a single, borderless code for survival. From those localized, highly dangerous, and literally explosive experiments in London, Salt Lake City, and Cleveland, we birthed a universal language of global mobility. Today, practically anywhere you go on planet Earth, a red light means stop, a yellow light means caution, and a green light means go. It really forces a profound reevaluation of our daily routines, doesn't it? As we sit at that red light on our morning commute, drumming our fingers in annoyance, how often do we actually recognize the forgotten inventors who built this invisible architecture? How often do we realize that our mundane everyday safety is the direct inheritance of risky experiments, explosions, and the brilliant, stubborn ingenuity of individuals who looked at the deadly chaos of the modern world and decided to bring it to a halt? So, the next time that light turns yellow, remember, you are not merely being told to slow down. You are actively participating in a century-old mechanical triumph, a glowing shield standing right between you and the chaotic forces of the world, a triumph that forever altered the course of human civilization. Keep that in mind on your next drive.